Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the launch event for the Global Property Rights Index. My name is Joe Daly. I'm going to be the host for today. I'm an employee at Gallup, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our London offices for this event. We are very excited to officially announce the Global Property Rights Index and share our plans with you, our big plans. But please note, as we go through the speakers today, that this is just the beginning, and it's the beginning of a long journey, and it's one that we hope you're going to come along with us. Before we go, I'd like to just make a few special thanks. So first and foremost, a special thanks to DFID and the Omidyar Network for their direct financial support for this last year's work. It's because of them that we're here today sharing some of these initial findings. I'd like to also make a special thanks to Land Alliance, who's serving as the technical lead for this project and has been a tremendous partner to Gallup over the past year. And finally, special thanks to our illustrious technical advisory group that has guided us throughout the way. It represents some of the best and the best people on the subject of property rights around the world. And so we're really glad to have them. It represents people from USAID and World Bank specifically. So I'd like to make a few programming notes before we move into the speakers. First, this is a live stream event, so the camera's in the back. So that will affect some of the Q&A that we do. So just be aware that we're going to try to have a section after each of the speakers to ask a few questions, but you'll ask it, and what I'll do is, since we have a microphone at the front, is I'm just going to repeat or summarize the question into the microphone for the people that are watching on the web. And finally, we are live on Twitter as well, #PRIndex. So if you'd like to join that conversation, please do. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker. We have Rachel Turner, from the director of the International Finance Department in DFID. She's leading policy and engagement with the development finance institutions and the private sector. Prior to this role, Rachel was director of East and Central Africa, leading policy and programs in 8 countries, including some of the most fragile states in the Horn of Africa. Rachel has over 20 years of development experience and a strong understanding of public and private sector development issues. Welcome, Rachel, and thanks for being here. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you very much to Gallup for hosting us here today. I think it's going to be a very exciting morning, and I'm delighted to be invited to be part of it. So Joe just set out my current job, my previous job. I also have the title of Land Champion in DFID, and that's something we do in DFID to give individual senior members a job on top of their day job, to champion a specific cause through the organization, but also with our international partners. So I am the land champion in DFID. Iris and my team are over there, and they know I'm a resource that they can use, and I'm particularly pleased to be here today because talking about transparency in the land sector is something that we've been doing in DFID for some time. So I just wanted to say a few general points and then some specific points about PRIndex. Generally, I just wanted to say from the UK government, you may have noticed that last week we launched 2 new reviews setting out our forward policy on development, one called the Bilateral Development Review and one called the Multilateral Development Review. Look them up, they're out there. But running through both of those is a very, very strong strand of emphasis on openness, on transparency, and on measuring impact. And those, I think, set the frame very well for why we are and continue to be committed to this piece of work on this index. So turning now to the specific issue of PRIndex, I don't think you need me to say very much about why security and why 10-year security matters. I think the arguments are well-founded that land tenure security is a critical foundation for poor women and poor men to build economic activity. And I think that is something that I think everybody in this room very much accepts. And that's absolutely why DFID has been supporting a large range of initiatives to strengthen tenure security for poor women and men. And we've got quite an extensive portfolio now in this sector. For example, work that we're doing on individual and communal land mapping and titling programs in Rwanda, Tanzania, Ethiopia and Uganda. I know the Rwanda program myself particularly well, a very exciting program that achieved a huge amount in a very short time. We're also working closely with investors, agribusiness particularly, and communities so that everyone can understand tenure rights, so that people can negotiate effectively with investors, and we have an important strand of work there in that space. And we're also working at the regulatory level as well in a range of countries, tackling changes in national laws and land governance systems to clarify who owns and uses what and make it easier to register land. So we're very proud of that portfolio, but until now we've had good ways of measuring the impact of each part of that portfolio, but what we have lacked is a way to compare from country to country and from year to year about the progress that's being made on people's tenure security on the ground. And we've also lacked a way systematically to compare what people themselves think about it and what they feel about the changes. So to that extent, we're absolutely delighted with this initiative here at PRIndex, and I know we're going to hear a lot more about the detail, but we do think that measuring people's changing perceptions of their tenure security is a really powerful way to measure progress in property rights. And I think we're going to hear more later, but certainly I think as this work expands, we're also going to get some very strong guidance about the policy areas we need to focus more on, and I think particularly of the urban piece. And I think some of the early findings we've seen from the index, I think really tell us some powerful messages about not just focusing in the rural space, but also thinking very hard about next steps in urban tenure security. I think also it's fair to say PRIndex won't necessarily tell us everything we need to know, but it will be a powerful indicator of where things stand, and it's going to complement some of the other parallel sources of data. So I think just, you know, I've said again why we're excited by PRIndex and some of the things we think that we are going to get from it, but maybe just to summarize those up. So we are hopeful that it will enable us to monitor property rights and progress in every country and region and track trends over time. It will give us a sense of whether the efforts supported by governments, donors, international organizations, civil society and business are making the difference we expect them to be making, and it will shine a light on regions and issues that need more attention and encourage policy reform and investment. And if we get it right, then PRIndex will be at the core of the international community's commitment to be able to measure the sustainable development goals. And that's quite a, you know, that is a big thing if we can get that right. The SDGs, which were agreed, do have specific commitments on land, including perceptions of land rights. I think that's right. I'm looking at people in the room who know more, and you can tell us more about that. So I think PRIndex has huge potential to do more in this space. It clearly is just a beginning. We have been involved. We would very much like others in the room to step up and continue involvement with the process as it goes forward, with the index as it goes forward. It's great that we've had access to a very strong technical advisory group. We've had USAID, AGRA, the World Bank and others in that group. But I think what we'd like to do after this morning is to see if we can build an even bigger coalition and group of support to take the index to the next level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Our next speaker is Malcolm Childress, who's the co-executive director for Land Alliance. Quickly, his bio. Malcolm Childress is a land resource specialist with 25 years of experience in strengthening property rights systems to achieve development goals for people in urban and rural areas. He led policy engagement and investment portfolios in land administration for the World Bank in Latin America and the former Soviet Union before co-founding Land Alliance in 2014. Before the World Bank, he was a senior researcher at the Land Tenure Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And on a personal note, he's been a tremendous force in the work we've been doing for the last year, and I thank you for that. You've been a great partner to us, and welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Joe. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. And I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that all of you could come today to launch the Global Property Rights Index with us. I want to start out with thanks to UK DFID and Rachel for your words and the support of the government of the United Kingdom for this initiative. Also to the Omidyar Network, which I think has had a vision of a transformative vision in the property rights space, of which this is one part. Also want to thank Gallup very much for the collaboration and partnership in this initial phase of the work, which has been tremendously exciting. And also to our technical advisory group, including a number of people in this room and others who could not come, who've guided and given a lot of effort and energy to shaping the ideas and the methods for the index. You know, really we're here because we want to change the world. We want to help create a world of security, of equity, of environmental sustainability, of gender empowerment in development. And property rights are an essential element of that effort. And learning and being able to monitor who has property rights and who is secure is a key element of that, and a key element of a journey that we are all taking together to achieve that state of development in the world that we're seeking. You know, property rights, I'll just talk about a few things in the presentation. Why property rights, a little bit about why the Global Property Rights Index, and then a little bit more about the kind of world we're seeking to achieve, in which this is one element. I think property rights are so basic and essential for economic and social development that it's something that's even often taken for granted. But property rights are really a fundamental cornerstone of economic development, of social justice, and of environmental management. Yet in spite of their essential role in development and in economic and social life, property rights are something globally that we actually know very little about. And in spite of decades of work in the development community, billions of dollars invested, there's still some very fundamental gaps in our understanding of people's perceptions of property rights and how secure people feel, how different settings and regimes of property rights translate into people's actual lived experience. And that's what we're trying to now address with the Global Property Rights Index. I just wanted, you know, we tend to think of secure property rights as being a vehicle for unlocking so much economic and social value in people's lives. I think I just have a few of those big ones in the graphic. The ability to invest and to take the benefits of investment for an individual, for a household, to improve businesses, to improve homes. Also the ability with that to store that wealth, to pass it on to next generation, to be able to transfer that, to use property within credit transactions as collateral, and the ability to finance new business and new economic activities using the value, unlocking the value of property. The ability to transact and to exchange properties, buildings, land, and to do that in a way that is safe and protected and does not involve huge costs of transaction. To reduce conflict, to reduce litigation, to improve social relationships between groups of all different types, to improve the management of natural resources, and so much really compelling, interesting work coming out now about the way that forests are managed and the importance of security and clarity in property rights for forest management and all of the implications that that has for environmental systems, for carbon storage, for water. Property rights also critical for citizens to be able to access government services, whether that's water infrastructure, other public infrastructure, even schools. I can remember sometimes in Guatemala speaking with residents of informal settlements who said, you know, the thing we really want is an address. If we can get an address, then we're allowed to send our kids to school. But if we don't have that, and if we don't have our property rights, we can't even get our kids registered for school. I think also secure property rights is a key piece of women's empowerment and women's ability to have economic opportunity, to have social resilience as family changes, and the ability for families to invest more in health, in education, and to have that security. So the really security of property rights unlocks across the spectrum of economic, social, and environmental benefits. And in that sense, I think are just such a critical piece of development. This is something that translates across urban, rural, and forest or rangeland or mountain spheres. And just to give you some of the magnitudes, you know, we know the estimates are around 1 billion people living in informal settlements, urban settlements globally, many of whom, and we're not sure how many, with serious property rights insecurity. 1 billion people in rural poverty, also very associated with insecurity in property. And another 3 billion people directly or indirectly relying on forest ecosystems and drylands, in many cases where property rights are uncertain. So in one way or another, this issue of insecurity of property rights affects almost the entire world population one way or another. So it's something that we really need, I think, as a development community to care about deeply. But why PRIndex? Because in spite of all of the recognition of the fundamental role of property rights across these spheres of development, we still don't really know how citizens perceive their security. And there are some fundamental data gaps at the core of our work. Much official data provides information on registration, on mapping, on the legal framework and who it covers. But this is not enough because we'd actually, without understanding people's own perceptions and how they actually perceive and understand their property rights, we don't understand then the behavior. Because people's real behavior, whether it's investment, whether it's planting new crops, developing land, caring for forest, building a business, depends on how they actually perceive and feel about their situation. We think, therefore, that this Global Property Rights Index can set a new global baseline for citizens' perception of the security of property rights. It also addresses this critical data gap in terms of the women's data gap, because most indicators so far, the few that we have tended to focus on households. But it's critical that we also understand how women as individuals perceive their property rights, because their behavior and their ability to respond to situations depends on that perception. And as Rachel said, we think that, you know, what gets measured gets changed. Having visibility and being able to monitor progress globally is something that can add so much more dynamism. How are we working with the global property rights? Well, we're launching right now on the basis of an initial phase of work that's been taking place over the last year, developing a module of questions with assistance from our technical advisory group, testing that in a number of countries with Gallup, carrying out a survey in 14 states of India. You have a report on your chair, and then also working in 10 countries to do nationally representative samples using those questions about people's, which we'll be speaking about, and then also conducting a mobile phone and internet-based survey in India. So this has been our initial attempts to develop, and I think we're coming up with some very compelling and interesting results. Where are we going? We're going to do a second phase over the next 3 years, refining our questions and survey methods, then rolling out globally in 2018. We expect these global baseline results by 2019, and then carrying out repeated rounds in 2020 to 2030 within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to achieve, as I said, a world of secure property rights. I think there's a virtuous circle that can be produced, in which by really focusing on the gap of insecurity, we can identify where and who and how security needs to be improved, and then with the involvement of governments, civil society, social entrepreneurs, the private sector, advance that progress, and then create a dynamic of continual change and improvement leading to this world of secure property rights. So let me close with a request for you to join us in this journey. To our international cooperation partners, we request your support in the effort to collect this data, to analyze it, to use it, to engage with your country programs and individual projects. To the research and civil society communities, we ask for your ideas, your collaboration, and your insights, country by country and globally. To the business and investment community, we look for your involvement to use these data, to work to make these economic investments a reality, and to governments for your policy responses to take on board the insights and use this to create this world of secure property rights for prosperity, justice, and sustainability. And we're launching at this point also our website, PRIndex.net, where we'll be posting data sets, reports, and carrying out consultation over the next several months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malcolm. Before we move to the next speaker, does anybody have a question specific to any of the remarks Malcolm just made? We will have time at the end for hopefully a general Q&A session, so if not, that's okay. All right, so our next speaker joining us on stage is Shreya Deb, principal at the Omidyar Network. Shreya leads the Omidyar Network's portfolio of investments in property rights in India. She has been closely involved in the development and execution of the PRIndex India report. She has been at Omidyar Network for more than 5 years and was previously a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. Welcome, Shreya. The stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about the PRIndex journey and looking forward to your support. What I'm going to do today is walk you through some of the early findings of the pretest survey that we did earlier this year, some of our learnings, and some of the open research questions that we feel we couldn't answer through this survey, and we really look forward to learning more about this topic as we go ahead. So the beginning of 2016, Gallup was doing a multi-state survey in India. The topics they were looking at were financial inclusion, food security, slavery. And we thought this was a great opportunity for us to try out this idea about, can we ask people what they think about their property rights? So we asked Gallup, can we tag on for 10 minutes at the end of your survey? We have a set of few questions. We'd really like to know what people think about their property rights, because we feel there's hardly been any attempt to systematically gather data about what people think, and it's probably not been done at this kind of scale that Gallup was going to do in India. The learnings from that has led to the development of the 10-country pilot that we'll be hearing more about, and leading to the Global Property Rights Index that Malcolm talked about. So this survey in India, we focused mostly on, are people worried about losing their home or their land? If they're worried, why? And have they at any point of time tried to update their property documents? We didn't have time to get into a host of other questions that we would have loved to ask. So when somebody says that they own property, that they own their home, is that true? Do they really have a document with their name on it that's registered in the government office to prove that they're the owner? We couldn't ask that. When someone says they're not worried, you could always paint a picture of, well, what if your husband dies and your in-laws throw you out of your house? Then would you be worried? Maybe they'll say yes, but that's so much of context. Can you really ask it in that way? So we also couldn't ask people if they felt insecure, so what? Does it impact their life in any way? What are the compromises they're making? Or if they even do feel secure, then what's the benefit? So we feel, we wish we could have asked all these questions, but we hope we can perhaps through the next stages of the survey. The survey spanned 14 states across India, pretty well represented across the length and breadth of India. It was 70% of the respondents were rural, which is as per the demographic split in India. Half of the respondents were male, most of them young, below the age of 35. Median income 14,000 rupees, which is actually the economically vulnerable section as defined by the government. Most people had a mobile phone, but very low internet access. Again, not surprising for someone coming from India. An education level, 1/3 of them had never been to school. Another 1/3 had only completed primary education. Most people said that they owned their own home. So either they owned it or someone in their family owned it, but at least 90% of them lived in an owned home, and about 5% were tenants. When we also asked them about land and whether they use agricultural land, 40% of the respondents from rural areas said that they used land for agricultural purposes. Women, as expected by us, were much less likely to own land or a home. We unfortunately don't have any benchmark for this. So our government data doesn't collect whether women own a home or own land. So even when the census is collecting whether you live in an owned house or a rented house, they don't record whether it's a man or a woman who owns it. They record if it's the head of the household who owns the home. So again, the fact that when you're not collecting data related to gender, you'll never know what the gap is. And so this is what our data suggests, that about 52% of women said that they own their homes. In case of men, it was 68%. So the first finding when we asked people, are you worried that you may lose your house against your will in the next 5 years? 27% of people said they were worried about losing their home. This worry was much higher among people living in urban areas. And to our surprise, women did not say they were more or less worried than men. So we didn't actually see a significant gap in the perception of worry between men and women. When we asked tenants if they were worried, nearly 50% of tenants were worried that they may have to lose their home. And what's interesting here is that in India, we have a number of laws which actually protect the rights of tenants. So you protect them from eviction, you protect them from arbitrary rent escalation. What's happened is that you've tried to protect tenants so much that it's swung the other way, and landlords don't want to give their house on rent. And that's a big challenge. We are facing a crucial housing crunch in India as well. The government has identified that we need to construct 20 million houses in the next 5 years to address this gap. And if you cannot unlock the rental market because of archaic laws which are right from the 50s, there's a lot of informal leasing that's going on. The problem's even worse when you're looking at slum settlements, because there's no documentation, nothing is getting registered. People have to shift houses every 11 months because you're afraid that if you give your house on rent, the tenant's never going to leave, and there is no recourse in the law to protect you from that. When we asked rural people about their agricultural land, 40% of people said that they use land for agriculture. Most of them said that this plot of land belonged to them or their family member, and it was located away from their home. So about 1/3 of them would use the same plot as on which their house is located, but about 2/3 of them had a separate plot of land. And about 19% of them were worried that they may lose this piece of land in the next 4 or 5 years. The primary reason for worry for all these people was the lack of documentation. So it's interesting that people really value the documentation, and if they don't have a document, then they are worried that they may lose their property. And this is the second important reason was the family disagreements. I mean, this was very obvious across homeowners, landowners, and tenants as well. And when we asked people, have they ever visited a government office to update their property records, nearly half of the landowners said that they had. This is different actually from what many government people perceive. Government officials perceive that people don't really care. It has to be a top-down approach where you go in there, map the house, and map the property and update records, and people are not going to, don't really care about it. It doesn't look like that from our survey. People care. People believe there's value in the document, and they want to get it updated. The question is, how easy is it for a person to go to a government office and follow the process? The more complicated you make it, the more expensive you make it, the less likely people are going to be able to update their records. Some early learnings. It's hard to ask people about their perceptions, about their worry, whether, you may need, so we didn't paint enough scenarios around, okay, what if this happens, what if that happens, but context is important. If there have been a recent spate of evictions in the area that you live in, clearly you're going to be much more worried than if nothing has ever happened, you're living in some remote area where there's no highway coming up and nobody's ever going to take your land in the foreseeable future. Lack of awareness, lack of information. People often don't know what documents they need. So they think they have a sale deed. It turns out it's just a power of attorney, which that's a local document, not been registered, and it has no legal standing in the court. But people don't know that. We had some surprises in the results. We thought we would have a number of people saying that they lease land for agriculture. It was a negligible sample in our survey. Although the official estimates are around 12%, NGOs on the ground say it could be as high as 20-25%. So the question for us was, are people afraid to say that they lease land? Because it's informal. Most land leasing is not officially recorded. So did that affect people's responses? We don't quite know. And women, we know that secure property rights can empower women, but the women in our survey did not appear to be more worried than the men. So we think it's raised some interesting questions. We really feel that there's a lot more research required on these topics. What are the documents that people need? Do they understand it? How easy is it to obtain it from the government offices? This whole gender gap, there are a few states in India that offer beneficial stamp duty rates if a woman has registered property in her name. And does that really impact? So are some states doing better than other states? Are these policies effective, and therefore should more states adopt these kind of policies? Single women is a big issue, but you never land up capturing. So are single women more insecure? Does the spouse influence how a woman responds to the question if your spouse is around? How do people plan for their future, for their investments? What decisions are they taking? Are they deferring certain decisions? Are they unable to take certain decisions related because they don't have secure tenure? Who are these people? What are the kind of demographics? Does it differ by state? Does it differ by certain population segments? And even as we go ahead and do research, is random sampling the right idea, or should we do it in a much more targeted sampling, and does that help us get more insights? So these are just some indicative questions. I'm sure the room will have much more, but we feel there's a lot. These are all very important topics, especially for my country, from the development perspective of India. And I really look forward to all of you joining us in this journey in answering some of these questions in the development of this index. So thank you.
Thank you, Shreya. Again, same format. So if there are any specific questions coming out of that, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll call on you now before we move on. Please.
Just one question about the survey. I think it's extremely important asking about what people feel. But most of the categories you listed were claiming either to be owners or tenants. I wondered if in rural areas you were looking at indigenous rights, and in urban areas, semi-formal rights. Was it a nuanced study? How did you manage to disentangle that variety?
Will you just sum up the question that you're about to answer for the people on the live stream?
Sure. So I think the question is, In rural, were we able to identify indigenous people, and did we have a separate set of questions and asking them about their rights? And in urban areas, did we look specifically at informal or slum settlements and talk about a different kind of right? So I think the short answer there is in rural, we didn't necessarily, so it was a random sample. So there are certain states in India where indigenous, or as it's called, tribal people in India are more, are form a greater proportion of the population. So those states were in there. It was a random sample, but we didn't specifically target indigenous people. And the questions were also not targeted around, okay, do you have community rights, etc. It was mostly around your home and your agricultural land. Could you own it or do you lease it? So we didn't have the amount of time to get into detailed discussions around that. And we think if we had to do indigenous, we'd probably have to do a much more targeted sample. It can't be across the 14 states. So there are specific states in India. We'd have to go deep down. We'd have to talk about forest rights and other associate rights in there. Urban, I think, is well represented in here. So the 30% random sample would definitely be taking into account informal settlements. I think that's the question where, often in these informal settlements, people perceive that they own that house. Even if the land has been encroached, people think they own the house. They know they're not going to get evicted. If something happens, then they'll probably get compensated. So people are not, people are not thinking about the whole continuum of rights. So we were only able to ask them, are you renting or are you owning it? We asked people if they are squatting, but they were not very honest. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. What else?
Another question in the back.
Yes, Belinda Goldsmith, Editor-in-Chief of the Thomson Reuters Foundation.
Hi.
Really interesting to hear about that, particularly on the gender gap as well.
Can you just ask the question?
Particularly interested to hear about the gender gap. When the interviewing took place, did you ask women without men being in the room? Because, of course, culturally, that can be a difference, the answers you're going to get.
So I'm sure the Gallup folks can answer better, but my understanding is that I don't think we asked men to go out of the room, but I think men were present. But
to the extent possible, we were trying to separate out the respondent from anybody else in the household. And generally, in most of these developing countries, it's an entire the village shows up for these interviews. So we do our very best to try and separate them. And most of these interviewers would have been trained to clearly try and take the women in this case separately, sit down with them, and actually conduct this interview. So we make every attempt as possible, but oftentimes it's unavoidable because the man might say, well, I need to be there to hear what she's saying because I'm the head of the household in this case, and you need to be talking to me. So our attempts in this case, it's a large sample, and we did our very best to try and separate out the women as we were approaching these questions. But I think it'll be interesting for you to hear also some of the stuff that we did in the pretest for the remaining 10 countries where we see similar results coming through.
yeah.
Okay, thank you, Shreya. So our next speaker, actually, you've heard from him already, is my colleague and friend Rajesh Srinivasan. He's the Director of Research for the Gallup World Poll. Dr. Srinivasan joined Gallup in 1993. He's the Global Director of Research for the World Poll at Gallup, which is an effort that was undertaken in 2005 that provides a scientific window into the thoughts and behaviors of residents in more than 160 countries. In addition to providing methodological oversight across all regions of the world, he also manages research efforts for the Middle East, North Africa region. Before joining the World Poll team in 2005, Dr. Srinivasan spent more than 12 years consulting with corporate clients in the United States and Asia. So warm welcome to Rajesh.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you all for being here. We are excited to share with you the findings from the pretest, the global property rights pretest that I was part of this in 2016. But before we go through that, I would like to say, especially this journey has been very interesting. In conjunction with the Land Alliance, the Omidyar Network, and the Department for International Development, Gallup initiated the 2016 very ambitious research to be able to quantify the global property rights.
And what we are looking at today is just the first step in this process, and the first phase of this process. And we are really looking forward to very exciting 2017 and 2018 ahead. The foundation for the Property Rights Index pretest really rests on the methodological rigor of the Gallup World Poll. You heard it shortly before that I oversee the World Poll. It is actually the single largest vehicle in terms of capturing thoughts and opinions in a very consistent way across 160 countries annually since 2005. It's built on some key features, and essentially a nationally representative sample of adults, not households, so we're clearly identifying individuals within the households. Probability-based sampling, regardless of which methodology, whether we are talking about face-to-face or telephone methodology. Rigorous pre-testing of survey items, very involved process, particularly given the number of languages we cover, typically in any given year, over 120 languages that we cover. Standardized training for interviewers and supervisors to ensure high level of consistency across fieldwork implementation. And the use of appropriate data collection methodology and validation protocols to ensure the highest quality data that we can gather. So the PRIndex results that you're going to be looking at are using exactly the same methodology that the Gallup World Poll has been using for the past 11 years. A total of 10 countries were identified across 5 broad geographic regions for the Gallup Property Rights, the Global Property Rights PRIndex test phase, the first phase. Peru, Colombia, and Brazil representing Latin America. Nigeria, Tanzania, Ethiopia representing the Sub-Saharan Africa. Greece from Western Europe. Egypt representing Middle East, North Africa. And India and Indonesia, 2 large countries representing Asia. I have to say that in Ethiopia, the quantitative data collection is on hold due to current conditions in the country. And many of you who are following what's going on there would probably be sensitive to the fact that it is quite difficult to be able to collect data at this point in time. With the exception of Egypt, in all other countries, data was actually gathered using handheld devices, and for the first time, using a very common data capture platform where the programming and the testing was all conducted by Gallup. So this further reinforces the level of confidence we have in terms of the consistency with which the data capture happened. Leading into the questionnaire design, we had a substantial amount of iterative process of qualitative assessments involving focus groups, cognitive interviews, and a limited number of quantitative pretests in each of these countries, with significant interaction, oversight, and guidance provided by the technical advisory group, leading to the set of questions that we were able to eventually field and collect data through. In each of these countries, with the exception of India, a nationally representative sample of about 1,000 was gathered. In India, we had a sample size of 3,000. What are the topics that we covered in the survey, as part of the survey? Clearly, the key outcome of interest to us, which is perception of tenure security. This is not only did we capture perceptions for the home that they live in, but also another property that they may own and may be a source of income for them. Clearly, beyond obtaining perceptions of security, what are the reasons for feeling secure or insecure? One key important ingredient that we picked up again from the India state survey that we did was, to what extent people had or were able to report that they had documentation and what kind of documentation it was. Perhaps not to the extent that one would expect or one would want to, but still we were able to capture some amount of information. And whether, as I said, whether they are using the property that they live in or some other property as a source of income, because it was important for us to know how they felt about the primary property that they live in versus the secondary property that they may be using as a source of income. And finally, what efforts are they taking to secure the property? Beyond these core questions, we were also capturing demographic information on age, gender, education, marital status, employment status, and the tenure type, whether they own, rent. Again, perhaps not to the great extent and detail one would want to be able to get the nuances, but at least at a basic level to be able to classify people into owners and renters. let's look at some of the key findings from this. First and foremost, of the 9 countries, since Ethiopia we could not collect data, of the 9 countries for which we have gathered, we were able to get data early enough for us to be able to look at the data and be able to share with you at this point. So we are here today presenting findings from 3 key countries, representing 3 unique regions, which is Nigeria, Indonesia, and Colombia. It's important to know, again, that these are perceptions, and so you have to bear that in mind as you look at each piece of the data that I'm going to be sharing with you. And it cannot be generalized beyond these 3 countries at this point. You need to focus primarily on these 3 countries. So what are the key findings? There are 5 findings that I want to touch upon today. The first one is, overall, when you look at these 3 countries, in each of these countries, 1 in 5 adults can be classified as tenure insecure. And I'll shortly tell you how we define tenure insecurity. It's not the way we had done as part of the India State Survey in terms of asking worry, but I'll tell you exactly what questions we asked. Second point, tenure insecurity is higher among renters than owners. Again, fairly consistent with what we saw in the case of India. In these 3 countries, we did not see any meaningful and statistically significant difference between women and men in terms of how they perceive their tenure security. A majority of owners actually reported having some kind of documentation. So this would be either a sale deed, a lease agreement, a rental agreement, or sometimes even a utility bill. And what was definitely most compelling was that the ownership of such documentation, at least for renters, seemed to give them a greater sense of security, at least in some of these countries. So those are the 5 that I want to dig into. But let me first start with the 2 key questions that really form the outcome measure that we are looking at. The 2 questions we asked, the first question was really, do you think it is at all possible that you personally could lose the right to live in this home against your will in the next 5 years? And if they said yes, we followed up with a question, do you think this will probably happen in the next 5 years or not? So based on the responses, if someone said yes to both questions, and obviously they were classified as insecure, if someone said no to either of these, they were classified as secure. So based on this definition, we can see in each of these 3 countries, roughly about 20%, somewhere from 20 to 23%, said would be classified as being tenure insecure. And this is about the property, the home that they live in. Alternatively, you could think of it as 80% being tenure secure. Important to remind again that these are perceptions and relevant in terms of thinking about these specific countries. What was interesting to us was considering how different these countries are in terms of cultural, economic, and institutional development, to find that roughly similar proportion of people feel insecure was a clear, sort of a big surprise to us. When you look at, especially when you look at how different these countries are in terms of tenure type, for example, Indonesia, over 8 in 10 say they or their family member own the home they live in, and just 1 in 10 are renters, either themselves or their family member rent. Whereas in Colombia and Nigeria, we see a much larger share of renters, 28% in Colombia and 33% in Nigeria. A small proportion in each of these countries also are in this sort of nebulous arrangement where neither they nor their family member own or rent, but they're still staying in that property or still staying in that home. The sample sizes for these groups are too small for us to be able to really dig in and try and analyze how they feel. As I said, the second key point here is renters feel less property secure or more insecurity than owners. Once again, across these 3 countries, it was really remarkable to see 1 in 8 feeling insecure among owners, whereas the proportion of people among renters who feel insecure varies from 40% in Colombia and Nigeria to 62% in Indonesia. Granted, the proportion of renters in Indonesia is a small number. It's only about 10% we're talking about. We had enough sample to be able to ask people among renters and among renters who feel insecure, what were the reasons they felt insecure. Now, the qualitative phase that we had conducted enabled us to actually drill down and say, these seem to be the top 4 or 5 reasons that people often provide for why they feel insecure. And so these questions, these are not volunteered responses, these were actually questions explicitly asked of the respondent. And you can see across all 3 countries, the top choice of reason why they feel insecure among renters is that they felt that the owner would actually make them move out. It could be because lack of documentation, it could be because of some of the things Shreya had mentioned earlier, that even if they did have a contract, every 11 months they would have to renegotiate, and it would not be taken for granted that they would automatically be able to renew the contract. The next point, and the next observation, is that between men and women, we really did not see any significant difference in terms of how they perceived tenure insecurity. So roughly, if you look at Indonesia and Colombia, they're very similar magnitude. They may be slightly lower in Indonesia, but again, statistically not meaningful or different. Once again, important to remember these are perceptions and reflective of the situation in just these 3 countries. We still haven't really gone through all the remaining 6 countries to really understand how consistent or how different the results might be across those countries. When we talk about documentation, which is an important piece of information we gathered, we asked documentation only of people who say they themselves, the respondents themselves own or the respondents themselves rent, because it's hard to ask about somebody else in the household having a piece of documentation. So these questions were asked only of the owners and renters themselves. Across all 3 countries, a majority report having some kind of documentation, usually the sale deed, a lease agreement, or a utility bill. 2/3 in Colombia and 3 out of 4 in Nigeria and Indonesia report having some kind of documentation. Once again, I would like to clarify that these are self-reports. Gallup did not verify whether they actually had the documentation. We did not ask them to pull out the document and show it to us. To the extent that they were telling this truthfully, we have to take it at face value. I would say that when doing the qualitative assessments, I did have the opportunity to talk to some of them and had the ability to ask, do they have the document here at home or somewhere else? And most often they would say, it's not here, it's somewhere else. It's with a friend, it's with a bank, it's with a family member. And as I probed a bit more, I realized that oftentimes these documents, like Shreya said, may not really be legal documents. These would be power of attorneys with very little sort of legal value. Or it could be in the name of an in-law, and they're just hopeful that eventually this property will belong to them. So, a documentation does give a greater sense of tenure security, at least in a few places. In this case, particularly in Colombia and Indonesia, you can see those who have documents, 90% of them feel secure with their current property, whereas those who do not have documents, only 62 to 64% feel secure in their current property. The Nigeria results are sort of a little weird in the sense that at least there's not the same level of consistency, and there is very little difference in terms of tenure security between those who have documents and those who do not have documents. The sample size is also incredibly small, so it's very hard to generalize beyond what we see here. At this point, these are the key findings from these 3 countries that we are able to share, but there is a lot more that we are looking at right now. And by early 2017, we'll be in a position to release a research report that summarizes all of the key findings, setting us up nicely for the 2017 pretest, further refinement of the items, and more importantly, having a sense of confidence before we get into the 2018 actual global data collection effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajesh. Anybody have any questions for Rajesh before we move to the next? No? Good job.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I hope that, if we do the full survey, such type of analysis will really help in policy making. Because and I think you just said it, my concern is the sample size. And as you said before, that we cannot generalize. But I'm looking forward to see similar analysis when we do the full survey, because what is coming out is very interesting, and I think it will have a greater impact on policy reforms. Because I'm looking at the Nigeria case, for example, how come that people who don't have documents, but as you said, the sample size is so small to make any generalization. Right. So I'm looking forward to see the future, survey. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, just one quick question. Most of the analysis that you showed us appeared to be based on data about perceptions of security over rights to housing. Do you have a similar data set for rights to land from the initial work that you conducted?
Can you just repeat his question before?
Yeah, I think the question was, most of the data we have presented is data about security with respect to the home, and do we have similar data with respect to land that they own? We did ask about the land, and there's a pretty small proportion of people who actually say they have access to land. Remember, the sample size for the national is 1,000. So when we have much smaller sample sizes for people reporting that they have land, it's difficult for us to be able to analyze with any great detail. So the information is available. It's just not large enough for us to have a great deal of confidence. Thanks.
One more question in the back.
Oh.
Thank you very much. My name is Evelyn Aresia from the Global Land Indicator Initiative. I appreciate really these thoughts that are coming out and the findings. My question is, was there any attempt to kind of do an analysis of probably the findings you have and the country situation and see whether there is any relationship in terms of the actual information available, for example, on ownership of housing? And for example, UN Habitat has been doing quite some work on property, particularly in urban areas. And maybe some of the data could be used to do some triangulation with what you have, just to give some insights on that. Thank you.
Thanks for asking that question. Those are precisely the kinds of things we will be doing as part of the report that we will be releasing in early 2017. When we combine all 9 countries, looking at country-specific, what is the context in which this data has to be placed and made sense of.
Thank you, Rajesh. We're going to stop the questions on this segment now, and if you have any, hopefully we'll have time at the end. So our next speaker is Monique Villa, who's the Chief Executive Officer for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Monique is the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation and founder of Trust Law and Trust Women. She has been ranked among the world's 100 most influential people in business ethics by Ethisphere. Since her appointment in 2008, she has transformed the foundation, launching a number of programs that leverage the expertise of Thomson Reuters to trigger change and empower people across the world. Monique was previously managing director of Reuters Media and chairman of Action Images. Welcome, Monique.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. This was a very interesting thing, the first attempt to try to understand the perception of people on where they live and what they own. And we know a bit about perception polls, and it's very important, but then you have to, the question on was the husband in the room or not is obviously very important. Thank you. Malcolm Childress said he wants to change the world. We are exactly the same. At the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we have 4 programs, and we really try to change the world. And one of these programs is just the power of storytelling. So what we do is that we cover what we call the totally underreported issues, namely women's rights, land and property rights, thanks to Omidyar Network, a very generous grant, and many others. So before speaking, I'm going to show you a very quick video of what we do for property and land rights.
Aje mangom romo bedo tek do pieni ka ngom pira pe bedo tek yira. Do wan wakwoni.
saayi naye natuba tutya batugobaganya tewabeerawo ogamba nti nabo balina ekyapa nti kikimu.
Todos los días tiene uno ese miedo de que cualquier hora llega el dueño de casa y Alba, vamos a arreglar eso, vamos a tumbar eso y me sacupa.
A pesar de que todo esto pues es ilegal y no hay escritura pública, no tengo nada. Yo tengo algo cuando tengo la posesión.
Kibra is home. The road that has been diverted is supposed to pass through our place. We think it's a way of chasing us away from this land. We lose our value, our culture.
हम अपने रोजी रोटी के लिए बम्बई आए, ये इसमें हमारा क्या रोजी रोटी का मसला है.
Housing is not something that is going to come tomorrow. So let us change the way that we are living.
Because it's the only way that you are going to keep your dignity so that you stay in a stable place.
Kubalulekile kaloku because ngumzi wakho awunalo nexhala awoyiki nokoyiba ye mhlawumbi angafika umasipala athi ngoku ndifuna le ndawo ungayazi uba nawuzobheka so ibaluleke kakhulu.
El beneficio que recibí fue ser titular de la tierra. Claro, como mujer pues me siento valorada, que valoran mis derechos y me siento importante.
Tubeera n'ettaka tusobola naffe okusomesa abaana era naffe ne tusoma. Tubeera n'ettaka tusobola okukulankulana.
Ate ne nsuubira nti awo wange wange.
So it just extracts from investigations we have done, one big one on the slums, the biggest slums in the world. And interestingly, teachers in UK, in Australia, and in many other countries started to tweet about it and to use it as an education tool. So we're going to push it to many more schools around the world because we think it's very important people know that even in a slum, you can have a property. And that it is a crucial issue. So place, which is our portal, means property, land, access, connections, empowerment. It's a bit complicated to remember all that I have to read it, but, but it's the agora idea of the Greeks, the piazza idea of the Italians, the place where you can discuss, and also the place where you live in. So that's our website. We did it to explain the very complex issues that are access to land, access to property, access to water, access to many other needs, and human rights needs. And we take all that from the human angle because it is the only way people really relate and try to understand. So it was indeed fascinating when we hired the editor for Place, Paola, she's here, Paola Totaro. I thought we would have a lot of candidates because it's a fantastic issue to cover because nobody does it properly. And it was very difficult. Very good candidates were very excited and then finally stepped back because they could not imagine how to tell that story. And tell that story is not that easy if you want to make it relate to the people. So this is what we do, and we do that since 6 months. We launched it in May 2016, and now we have already, the website has already more than 500 million people on it. And this is for the website. But through the Reuters wires, because all our stories goes on Reuters wires, so it goes to all the clients of Reuters, we reach every day 1 billion people. So we do that in 6 months, but I am pretty sure that in 2 years' time, so you know, the New York Times uses, the New York Times put it on homepage, the Slums investigation, on their homepage, on their website. And you know, they all can use it. We give it for free to anybody who wants. And it will start to provoke investigations, to provoke more research, more thoughts, etc. So I'm very excited by this platform. It is, we have 10 journalists working only for Place around the world and in London. And we have, the total of journalists at the foundation is 40 journalists, 40, around the world, plus 200 freelancers that are working for us also. So 10 are specialized on property rights, but all the others also write about it when it comes. And as we know, what we cover are the underreported issues at Thomson Reuters Foundation. And among the underreported issues, you have a lot of connections, what we call the hidden connections. That is to say, when you speak of slavery and trafficking, you speak of very vulnerable people. India is the country which has most slaves in the world. They have 18 million slaves in India, known, probably more. And so all these issues are connected. Human impact of climate change, where millions of migrants are leaving countries because of what happens with climate change, etc., become vulnerable, become the prey of traffickers. And of course, a huge issue of access to property and access to different rights. So in just 6 months, we have published over 300 original stories on some of the most complex aspects of land and property rights. From the landless widows in India, you know, when you lose your husband, you lose your land very often. And Africa, the land goes to the brother of the husband, etc., etc. So from there to the land reform in Scotland and many others. We have had thousands of pickups by news outlets in 60 countries. For instance, Green at What Price was a very good multimedia piece done on plantations in Uganda, which explains the tensions between the commercial plantations and the people who live on the land. And it was done with drones, and it was superb. Tencent, which is the Chinese Google, translated it and published it. So it's 300 million people who had access to that story in Chinese. This is very important to us at the foundation, because when you want to speak, you don't want to speak only to the English-speaking world. We speak to the rest of the world. And we cover slavery in India. We have, thanks to another grant from CNA Foundation, 2 journalists who only cover slavery in India, only that. And we translate everything they write in Hindi and in Tamil to distribute it to the press, which doesn't speak English. And in India, only 5% of the press speak English and 5% of the people. So we try really to change things through information and news. This piece of Green at What Price was taken not only by Tencent, but also by The Atlantic and many others in Italy or in Africa. And another big one was the Slums series, and it was also used everywhere and on the front page of the New York Times Live. Cape Town's slum story in itself, it was part of that series, was shared by UNICEF. UNICEF was 5.7 million followers. So anybody, you in the room who want to use it, you can. You can put it on your website. It's for free. We will help you do that. So the fact that means, you know, 5 years ago, nobody, really nobody in the world knew that there were so many slaves in the world. And we decided to shed light on it by dedicated one day of our conference, Trust Women, to slavery and trafficking, and to cover it with our journalism. And then, you know, New York Times, Guardian, many, many others all around the world started to be interested in the issue and do their own investigation. What we hope is that with Place and this issue of access to land and property, exactly the same will happen. In 2 years' time, you will have big investigation by the New York Times, by Vice, by Guardian, and all the others on this issue, on essential aspects of the issue. And this is what we try to do. One last word, if you allow me, is we have 4 programs at the foundation. So we also train journalists around the world on how to cover this issue and then mentor them. We have a program called Trust Law, which is the biggest organization for pro bono. So we have 620 law firms, member of Trust Law, that work totally pro bono for 3,000 NGOs and social enterprise in 175 countries. What we do is, once we have vetted the NGO and the social enterprise, if you know some of them which are good, let us know, they can benefit. Once they are member, we take over all their legal needs, all their legal issues. And we do a lot of cross-border research. We have done some massive research on land rights for Landesa and for many others, for one in Latin America, on indeed, how could you show that the bit you own in your slum is your property, etc., etc. So help us grow again, and we will be happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. So our next speaker we'll be hearing from is Keshinee Shah, who's a senior manager at Dalberg Global Development Advisors in Mumbai. Keshinee is the project lead at Dalberg Global Development Advisors based in Mumbai, India. She has been involved in developing and delivering a project to use online tools to deliver rapid survey results. Welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Joe. This is going to be interesting. A slightly different presentation. I will call this out at the beginning. We do not have data yet to share with you. What we are going to be sharing is some of the insights we found, some of the challenges and sort of semi-upsides we found of using this kind of data approach. I think just very quickly, I mean, this is the agenda. We'll go into it. But very quickly, who is Dalberg? I'm not sure how many people in this room have heard of us. But we are a advisory firm, a strategy-based consulting firm, focusing only on development. We have 15 offices globally. We have extensive experience in inclusive growth, which covers the whole span of financial inclusion, infrastructure development, gender disparity, and of course now increasingly property rights. So this is a project that we're doing with Omidyar Networks. I think the one more thing to call out about Dalberg, as part of the Dalberg portfolio, both in the strategy work that we do, we use a lot of research methods. So we have significant experience of the entire research toolkit, quant, qual, face-to-face, focus groups. We even have a specialist business called the Design Impact Group that specializes in human-centered design research. RCR, rapid, or rather real-time rapid cycle research. I think what we've heard today is a lot of face-to-face based interviews. This is something that we're testing. What it does is essentially, it's supposed to be an agile tool, right? It uses a number of data collection modes to really achieve scale. And this is exactly what we're testing at the moment. The key difference between the RCR methodology and face-to-face is, of course, we are very limited by the number of questions we can ask. So a key challenge under RCR is to get to a defined set of questions that can be asked quickly, rapidly, to get to as much nuance as you can. We all understand in this room, I think, that property rights are not simple. Face-to-face allows you to really deep dive. RCR does not. But we're sort of going through the process, and it's as much as learning experience for everyone at this point. The idea as well is actually that based on something that's focused, it should be able to reach people, particularly when you use different data collection modes. It's a flexible tool. It reduces the dependence on time and place when you're trying to speak to people. It is supposed to be quick and efficient. As I mentioned again, the variable data modes there. Assuming that you can actually achieve a standardized methodology, it should also be scalable, right? If you can achieve a standardized questionnaire, data collection modes, you understand the design principles of other countries, this is something that may well be easier to scale than face-to-face. And that also leads to the cost effectiveness of it. What we have done as part of this research, we have 3 different types of sampling plans. Okay? So we have a sample plan of 10,000, which is nationally representative. And then we're really going into sort of more deep dive areas. We have boosts, or small boosts as we're calling them, in 4 different states in India, and they're approximate sample size of 2,200 in each state. And the idea behind going for a small boot versus a national representative sample is that in the boost states, you can actually try and deep dive into some of the local nuances. I think for those of you that know India, it's not a simple country, right? We have national laws, we have state laws, we have local laws, and all of these things. I think Shreya had pointed some of this out, was there is a very limited uniformity in how India was viewed. So the idea behind going with different different sampling plans is we can get to those specific nuances with the limited question set that I'd already called out. The last one is what we call the deep boost state. This is Maharashtra. We're aiming for a sample size of 15,000, and this is where we're really going to be testing the ability to geotag, right? So spatial analysis, see how we can get to that level. And what it does at a district level within the state of Maharashtra is analyze districts, right? District versus district. So we're looking, for those of you that are familiar with India, I'm going to call out some names that you probably never heard of, but a Nashik versus a Nagpur versus a Pune. And this would hopefully get us also to some of the tribal level analysis, because some districts trend to be more indigenous in terms of their demographic population segment versus others. So that is the overall aim. Data collection modes, I don't think any of these are new at all, but we're using IVR versus SMS and versus online. Now, this is really important for India, and that is that we have an internet penetration of about 30% in India. So online itself, we do not believe is going to give us the sufficient level of sample that we require. So this is really a combined approach where IVR, at this stage, some of the early indications of data show that IVR is able to penetrate and able to reach most demographic segments versus online that is largely focused on urban literate populations at this point. Okay. How do we fit with RCR? Well, actually, we're part of core PRIndex, essentially. It's interesting. We've spent a significant amount of time going through the core PRIndex questionnaire set, trying to align with it. Of course, as I mentioned, the challenge here is really 15 questions. I don't remember the number of PRIndex questions, but it was significantly more. And we've sort of made sure alignment on both the questionnaire front and the sampling front. Core PRIndex was also a nationally representative sample. The idea behind RCR is we take that to scale. I think it's important, Rajesh had mentioned the 2 questions about probability and possibility of losing your home. And those are 2 of the 3 questions that we have lifted directly from PRIndex, put it into the RCR methodology as a means to test whether those kinds of nuances can actually be achieved through a sort of more remote interview technique. I think, you know, the other point, and it's important to call out here, is this whole point about subgroup analysis, right? This is exactly what we're trying to go after with RCR, which is kind of limited when you're trying to do face-to-face, A, because of time, B, because just sheer reach in some of these geographic locations. The other point here is that you know, we're not actually trying to compare, but it is important to call out, and I'll call it out once again, is that PRIndex is comprehensive and definitely more nuanced. RCR is less comprehensive, but the ambition here is to achieve greater flexibility overall. Okay, so I'm going into sort of some of the early learnings we've learned so far. There are kind of 4 essential process management steps that we've undertaken. You'll see number 4, data analysis to be decided. Vendor selection and sampling, you know, and the whole contracting thing. So we really did try and develop a long list of vendors. I think the key challenge here is there are a limited number of vendors globally that can do a mixed methodology approach. So we have, for example, we're using a vendor that does online only. one vendor that offers a mix, IVR, online, and SMS, and a third vendor that only does IVR. And actually, that was a pretty significant challenge. We were lucky that we got 3, so we have hopefully some sort of vendor-to-vendor comparison. Another challenge about a part of this whole process was putting together a very rigorous sampling plan. This took a lot of effort to go back and forth, what kind of sample sizes we want, what type of confidence levels were we happy with, did we want to go national representation across India versus state versus deep boost, etc. And hence you saw earlier how we came up with this mixed sampling plan to sort of test what works where and at what level. There is one more thing, and I think this might be sort of specific to India. If I haven't mentioned this already, we're only using this in India, by the way, at this point. So the India challenge was we have quite strong laws about what we call do not disturb or do not dial calling list, and it's a real compliance issue when you're using IVR. When you are working with global vendors, compliance with local laws is really, really important. And what we have found is some of the global vendors have had to actually take up partnerships with local vendors, which just complicates things a little bit more to achieve that level of compliance. Okay. I've already mentioned the survey setup and design, but a key point there was the questionnaire design. We only have a maximum of 15 questions. One of the key things we're testing as part of this is 15 the ideal number, or actually should it be 5? Because you also find if some of the early indications on drop-off rates is, people start getting, they start dropping off at about question 9 or 10. That's still work in progress, so please don't quote me on that. But one of the answers we're trying to achieve is, if you're going to use remote research, what is the ideal number of questions you can ask? And that will have challenges going forward to what are the key issues that you want to identify, especially since we know that property rights is not a black or white question. Okay. Survey deployment and data collection, we're in the midst of this right now. A key learning here is actually regular check-ins with the vendors. This is really, really important. Getting them to send you the data, making sure it's clean, getting access to the dashboards. We're talking about fairly large sample sizes here. And again, if we go back to, what are the aims of RCR? We're trying to get demographic representation across India. It's really important to check that. It's really important to check if they're weighting, to what level are they needing to weight the data. And that really gives you very early clues and hopefully sort of earlier means to address some of these issues. The data analysis part, as I said, we don't actually have anything on it yet. But what is becoming increasingly clearer is, RCR is one of these things that I think it's not been the most efficient process so far, but the challenges around that are developing deep relationships with vendors, having a methodology that works and is scalable, and I think these are some of the earlier teething problems. At the end of the day, if you have established relationships with good vendors that can do this and an established methodology, we do believe that it should be scalable at a global level. Okay. Just to sort of sum this all up, I think, individuals, other speakers have called this out earlier, but our early indications suggest that RCR alone cannot get to the level of nuance that's required for property rights. I think, we're in early stages of property rights in most of the developing world. It's an area that has, a lot of challenges, a lot of nuances. There are some very significant differences between a male literate urban sitting in a Mumbai versus, maybe a rural woman agricultural community in the outskirts of Bihar. So, RCR at that level, yes, can probably reach those people, but is probably going to be challenged in terms of understanding those nuances of what really drives it. So, at a high level, what we believe at this point is RCR can really be used in 2 ways, right? It's part of an overall research toolkit. One way of using RCR is to actually go out and test at scale, and then complementary to PRIndex, use PRIndex to deep dive into specific issues or even specific demographic segments identified by RCR. There are lots of ways you can then go in to look at which demographic segments do you need to intervene on specifically to create impact, sustainable impact. HCD is just one way of doing that. You could actually do some sort of focus groups, more face-to-face, more deep diving that way. The other thing that RCR does is it offers you maybe a quick solution to do monitoring, so M&E impact evaluation on a more regular basis. So again, this is something that we're still testing, and we hope to have an answer shortly. It's going to take some time. I think we're expecting initial results out in January, working with Omidyar to achieve that quite closely. Thank you.
Thank you, Keshinee. Does anyone have any questions before she sits down? Thank you. So our last speaker for the day is Peter Rabley. He's a venture partner at Omidyar Network. Peter leads Omidyar Network's investment in property rights. He brings more than 25 years of experience as an entrepreneur, business leader, and technologist. Before Omidyar Network, Peter founded and built International Land Systems until it was acquired by Thomson Reuters, who he then joined as a vice president for global business development and strategy. And I'd like to personally thank you, Peter, for it was just a year and a couple of months ago that you came to our office, and this man has a huge vision for this, and you've been a force in the execution. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Good morning. In many ways the tip of the iceberg, as we like to think about it. I think many more questions raised today than we can possibly answer, and that's what we'd hoped. We'd hoped that this would kick off a conversation that we haven't had before, would give us data that would make us think, make us say, this is not right, something doesn't seem right, we need to do more work, we need to do more thinking about the questions. I'd like to thank DFID and Rachel for your words this morning. I'd particularly like to thank Iris. We turn it off? Yeah. Yeah. Iris Kreber, who's with us here today, for her support and her recognition of the value of PRIndex and joining us in co-funding this in this work. I'd like to thank Malcolm Childress with Land Alliance for being brave enough to agree to take this on. I know it's a passion of Malcolm's, and he's dedicated many, many hours and thinking to this work, and has put together a very good technical advisory group, which we hope grows and expands as the work continues in the future. I think the broader the representation of the advisory group, the better it will be. And you know, it's interesting what made us think at Omidyar Network that this was important. Monique from Thomson Reuters Foundation talked about stories. And it's interesting when I travel around and I tell people what it is that I do. I say I work on property rights issues and land issues. Almost everybody has a story then to tell me about a problem they have with their property. My grandfather's property in Nigeria, we've not dealt with it because we know if we do, we're going to unlock all these issues. And it's quite amazing, and it's anecdotal for me to say this, but it is remarkable how often everybody I talk to has a property rights story. And until we start discussing it, it may not have been top of mind and may not have come forward. And it made me realize, and our team realized, that we didn't have a lot of good data about, well, how bad are the stories that everybody has? Actually, there are some people in the room who attempted a number in a very interesting manner that became a bit of an apocryphal story for the land sector. But we knew that number probably wasn't right, that such a significant proportion had no land rights. So we said, how do we go about dealing with this? How do we go about collecting this information? And what's available to us, I think, is this wonderful partner in Gallup and their methodology of the world poll, and how we get to people's perceptions, and how we do that in a rigorous fashion and in a consistent fashion and in a repeatable fashion. because from there we can develop a baseline. And if we have a baseline, we can monitor progress, which is, of course, what we want ultimately, is to drive those numbers down, the numbers of people that say that they are, in fact, insecure or don't have access to the land that they should do. So we think this is a great way to tell another story. At Omidyar Network, we're deeply committed to PRIndex, both now and in the near future, and we're excited about those of you that would like to engage both at the technical level and partner with us at the financial level as well. It was interesting, recently we had a presentation from the World Bank team that leads the PRIndex, which is a similarly named index tracking financial inclusion, which has been going 7 years. And we asked them, if there's one thing that you could take back to 7 years ago that you've learned after 7 years, what would it be and what would you do differently? And they just said, pilots, pilots, pilots. Test, 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 and learn. Because what you think might mean one thing to one person certainly doesn't mean that to somebody else. And we know that's the case. We know that that's the case when we ask, do you own? People say they own, and they may think they do, but actually, perhaps legally, they may not. So we have plenty of work to do to expose those types of issues, to get to questions in each context that can allow us to get the best possible results and to repeat those best possible results. So we're very excited. I know that tomorrow, thanks to DFID and the Legend team, there is a more detailed technical session, which many of you attend. If you're not and you're interested, please see Malcolm after the event for details on that. I would note that everything that is being funded will be openly and publicly available at no cost and no charge, including the data. Again, we want to stimulate a conversation, so we want people to have at it with the data and see what they find and see if they throw up other things, other nuances, and can question and challenge, all with the idea that this is made better and we get more information. So again, thank you to Gallup for this wonderful space and hosting us. We, I know, have some coffee and tea afterwards. We'd ask you to mingle if you have time and meet Malcolm, some of the other team members, and be happy to answer any more questions in detail. Thank you all again for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We have a little bit of time, so I'd like to open it up for any questions that the group here might have before we close.
Hello, I'm Julian Baskin from the Cities Alliance. I was just wondering whether it is able to target a little bit, in the sense that there's definitely a growing mass eviction of communities resident on waterfronts. And we see this throughout Africa right now, often linked to climate change, often linked to a lot of things, but there's definitely a grouping that's more vulnerable than others at this point.
Does anybody, any of the speakers want to address that?
Yeah, we're definitely interested in as we move on in additional phases, in trying to target around more where we know there are specific problems of insecurity, and being able to oversample in some of those areas, so that we would have, on the one hand, general indicators that are representative nationally, but also be able to focus in. We're certainly interested in focusing on a number of types of urban problems. We have not zeroed in on waterfront specifically, but on variety of vulnerable communities as target for this kind of oversampling. So we do anticipate trying to narrow in on some of those types of situations and groups.
It's Michael Green from the Social Progress Imperative. The first thing I want to say is bravo. This is a fantastic effort. Certainly we from the Social Progress Index are going to be customers for this. So please, come on, bring on 2018. We want your data. I've got two questions. One comes from someone online who tweeted at me, in terms of insecurity, to what degree is debt driving insecurity of tenure? I don't know if anyone's got an answer for that. My question was responding to Rachel's point about the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a whole set of efforts now to improve measurement of things under the SDGs. How's the PRIndex aligned with the UN efforts on measurement and alignment of housing, shelter and land issues?
Yeah, actually, and I want to point out, I would actually like to give Evelyn also a chance to talk about this, who's one of the people responsible for the working on the SDGs from the UN Habitat. But right now, the indicator for land 1.4.2 is a kind of two-part indicator. It says we're going to gather official data about what is registered, what governments say the property rights situation, and then the second part is perceptions. And so, but the data sources for perceptions are really thin. We think that the Global Property Rights Index will provide a really much fuller and much richer data source for that perception side. We do not, with this index, pretend that we'll be trying to fulfill the official data side. There are other groups and institutions, national statistics offices that are doing that. But on the perception side, we think that the Global Property Rights Index, PRIndex, is going to be a key data source for that SDG indicator.
Thanks very much. Just picking up on that last point, I think the whole issue of perception is really very, very important, because when you're dealing with a range of situations, in urban areas in particular, trying to unlock the variety in terms of assessing the policy implications is actually very important. So using percentages can be a bit dangerous. I just wonder whether you're actually using qualitative case studies to go a bit more into depth on a selective basis, maybe using the sample surveys as a framework, and then taking a percentage of those maybe for in-depth case studies, so you can enrich the data that you're collecting. But many congratulations on what you've done so far.
We have been developing in our testing a number of qualitative narratives and experience to try to drive our formulation of our questions. We are anticipating that the index itself will be quantitative, but it does draw on this base of testing of qualitative engagement. What we're also hoping is that other researchers, country by country, will take off from some of the quantitative results and try to probe deeper into those. We've really seen the Global Property Rights Index not as just a number that's going to sit there, but rather as a process that's going to, around those numbers and those indicators, drive an engagement. And so we're really looking forward to country researchers, to partners in governments, to take off from the initial results and then dive into those specific situations with case studies, with policy and programmatic work, and then try to see how that can impact the changes. We come back and look at it quantitatively. So directly, no, we're not trying to develop the qualitative ourselves in the PRIndex index itself, but we really hope that that will be a part of the engagement strategy as we go country by country.
Okay. Well, especially thank you. Oh, one more question before we close.
Thank you. It's building on the last response, if I may. If you're looking at a perception, then there's going to be a spectrum of people's opinions and people's views. Would you like to comment on, have you made any approaches to the equivalents where they exist, certainly in the 10 countries you mentioned, of things like the local or national land registries and how they perceive this issue to affect their people?
Yeah. Actually, no. we're really, this is people-centered. We're really focused on citizens' perceptions. We, of course, interested in how institutions and are themselves supplying and providing the legal framework, services, registrations, property rights, and the like. But the perceptions we're really interested in are for the consumers of those services and the demand. So our actual survey population is focusing on individual citizens at this point.
Thanks, Malcolm. Okay, well, again, just want to say thank you to everyone for being here today. Also to those joining from the web, thank you for joining. Just kind of in summary, quickly, some of the things that you heard today is one, this is a really big challenge for development. Number two, I think has been clearly outlined that this is a data gap. And we really believe that this is the beginning. This is the launching pad, this event right here. So over the next 18 months, 24 months, there's much more to come. And we really believe this can become a catalyst for many, many more things to help push development as a whole forward. So thank you for joining, and we'll see you out there for some donuts and coffee.